So now let's start defining the areas of the page using div tags. Now the div tag is actually an HTML tag that doesn't really do much of anything. Think of the div as a container for other things on the page and a place that you can apply styles to affect elements within that container. So to insert a div, I put my cursor in the page, and the easiest way is to go up to the Common Insert panel here and choose Insert Div. Now Dreamweaver gives me this nice little dialog and gives me a few options about how and where I insert it, and I'm going to give it an ID at the same time. Bear with me for now. I think this will start making more sense as you do it a few times, but for the moment, I'm going to identify this div as my container. And then I'll click OK. What I've done now is simply create a little box here, and if I split the screen, you'll be able to see better, because against this dark blue background, it is a little hard to read that text. I've got content for ID container goes here. Dreamweaver automatically adds this little bit of text just to make it easier for you to see your divs, because a div with absolutely nothing in it doesn't actually take up any space. And if you don't have some content there, it can be a little hard to find those divs on the page. So of course you can replace this content with your own text, images, etc., but Dreamweaver will insert this when you create divs. I've called this div the container div, but I could have called it almost anything I want. Again, the same kinds of rules apply. No spaces or special characters, except dashes or underscores. But it's a very common convention on the internet to call the main div, the one that surrounds most if not all of the other elements on your page, to name that div container. So I've given my first div the ID container, and now inside of that div, I can start putting other divs. I can also start creating styles to control the position and placement of those divs. So for example, I could create a new style, clicking the New Style button, and notice something helpful here. Because my cursor is inside this div, Dreamweaver assumes I want to create a style for container. And because Dreamweaver sees that I'm using an ID to identify this div, it knows that I should use a # to create an ID style. Now I told you earlier, different kinds of styles have different kinds of indicators, like there's a period or a dot before a class style. Well, anytime you have an ID style, you'll have a # before that style. So click OK, and now I want to create a style that will position the content on my page. And I can use the box option. You might have heard people talk about the box model in talking about CSS. And I can specify things like width. So I know that I want this page to be 780 pixels wide. And I know that I want my design to float in the middle of the browser window on my user's monitor. I want to essentially center this div and make it 780 pixels wide. But one of the things that's very confusing about working with CSS is that you can't just center a div on the page. You can, however, get the effect of centering by using the margin options. So I'm going to turn off the same for all, so I can specify different options for each margin. And I'm going to set right and left to auto. You'll see in a moment how this trick enables you to center a div on a web page, even though there's no center a div tag. The other thing I'll do is set the background color to white. And that will allow me to have content on a white background floated within this dark blue background. So let me click OK, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. Now, if I select this div, I want you to see this little bit of margin on each side. And if I stretch out my window a little bit, notice that as the display area gets bigger, the margins automatically adjust so that the same amount of margin space is added to each side of the div. That's what enables me to center that div tag. Let me bring my work area back to the target work area that I'm using. We'll spend a lot more time on margins and paddings during this series, but for now, I just want you to know that wonderful trick for centering a div. By the way, if you don't see the visual aids that show you where the margin is on each side of the div, this little shaded area right here, you may want to choose View, Visual Aids to turn them on. That's the CSS Layout Box Model option that makes those margins visible. You could also choose to turn on or off many other visual aids using this menu option. I like having most of them turned on so that I can see what I'm doing as I'm working, but if they get in your way or you don't like them, you can always turn them off until you need them.